So are you going to intro?
Yes.
Okay.
Is my audio pretty good now?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, everyone. We have Dan Held here, growth at Kraken, and he'll be doing a talk around HODLers are the revolutionaries. And I'll let him take it from here.
Thanks. I appreciate y'all having me. And today, what I'm going to talk about is HODLers, which a lot of people just think of the word HODL. I know HODL representing that random post on Reddit that an individual did many years ago, back in 2013. But HODLing and the relationship that HODLers or believers in the protocol have is incredibly important to the success of these different crypto protocols. Now, for Bitcoin, it is the core reason why Bitcoin is around. And I'll dive into that in this deck, and we'll explore the emotion, the sacrifice, the all of the components of what made HODLing such an important critical part of developing Bitcoin's ecosystem. So some of what I'm pulling in today, and including some of the quotes and the graphics, are from my book called Planting Bitcoin. It has not been released yet. Planting Bitcoin is about Bitcoin's origin story, which covers how Satoshi chose not just the right species of money to plant, but the right season, soil, and the gardening techniques. And so hodlers in the gardening stage represent a very important part of ensuring Bitcoin succeeding. Just to cover some of the basics here before we dive into hodlers, when Satoshi created Bitcoin, he created a new species of money. And with each species out there, there are different traits that this species has. So for Bitcoin, there are different traits that Bitcoin had as a species of money. If you look on this chart, which it compares to Bitcoin to gold and fiat, Bitcoin is very advantageous in terms of its portability compared to gold. And then in terms of like the censorship resistance is incredibly high, and across the board in terms of how Bitcoin has been created, and for example, the verifiability. Gold is extremely hard to verify. So when we look at Bitcoin as a new species of money, the core fundamental reason why Bitcoin is a better sound money than gold and fiat are due to these traits that it has as a money. Money over time evolves and either thrives or dies, just like any species does. It either needs to have advantageous traits to survive and thrive, or it'll go extinct. And if we look at money through time, we as humans, we have very short lifespans versus money. And this chart shows the survival or the lifetime of a typical the typical reserve currency. So right now, most of us have seen only, most of us aren't over 100 years old. So we've seen the U.S. very much dominate, being that world reserve currency. But this is only a temporary era. In the future, there will be another one, and I fully believe that will be Bitcoin. Now, a new money just doesn't come into existence and immediately become successful. A lot of people complain about Bitcoin's volatility, but that's actually a good thing. It increases awareness of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin was never going to move in this linear path from $0 per Bitcoin all the way to 100,000, a million, $10 million per Bitcoin, and have this nice smooth path where everything just went okay. No, it's going to be a choppy run from going from 0% mind share, because money ultimately is a belief system, going from 0% mind share to a very large percentage of the world population believing in it. And I created this chart to help visualize this. This was inspired by Murad. Murad is a hedge fund manager in the space. And so I put the price of Bitcoin on here. And if we look at Bitcoin's evolution in terms of stages of money, we're somewhere between the collectible and store value stage. Each of these stages are additive. So money starts out as a collectible, then becomes a collectible and a store of value, and then becomes useful as a store of value, collectible, and medium of exchange. And right now, we're kind of in the early stages of Bitcoin going between collectible and store of value. And now we're finally going to get into the role that hodlers play. So Satoshi was a really interesting character because when he built Bitcoin, he knew that he couldn't be the centralized component of the spirit of Bitcoin, of the ethos of Bitcoin. And so I called Satoshi the gardener in my series Planting Bitcoin, because he essentially allowed Bitcoin in terms of planting it at the right time, the right soil, and getting it at the right community. He planted it just in the right way for it to succeed. Satoshi even left, ensuring that Bitcoin would only survive through the the HODLers of the believers in Bitcoin. So what I want to bring up here, which is kind of a fun delve into like the journey that a HODLer goes through, a HODLer has to overcome all these different struggles. And that's why if you take the hero's journey, this is a really good analogy for HODLing. Because when you first hear about Bitcoin, there's this call to adventure. There's different struggles that you go through as learning when you learn about Bitcoin and when you learn about how it's changing the status quo. I mean, you relearn things about money, your government. It's sort of, when we talk about taking the orange pill, it really is that awakening moment. There's some, when we delve into this, Satoshi really built Bitcoin for the believers in a new financial system. He created Bitcoin as the call to revolution. And these revolutionaries were disenfranchised with the existing financial system. And we have to remember that Satoshi built Bitcoin and launched it. So he built it over the course of a year and a half before he launched it, but he launched it right in the middle of a financial crisis. And the only message he ever included on the blockchain was about a very anti-central bank message. UK Chancellor on the verge of second bailout for banks. Satoshi built Bitcoin for revolutionaries, for people who were like, what, fuck the existing system. This is messed up, and I want to build a whole new system. And the hero's journey through HODLing is this journey of going through, like I mentioned before, you got this call to adventure and revelation, but it's this whole, HODLing isn't just about HODLing Bitcoin, it's an entire reconfiguration of how you look at the existing centralized systems and look back at Bitcoin and decentralized systems and realize the potential that it has. And that's where, when we look at Bitcoin's adoption curve, it's actually very closely linked to the price of Bitcoin. And through that, there's this viral loop. Satoshi had a really interesting quote, and he had this quote before Bitcoin had any value. And I'm looking at the quote to make sure I don't misspeak it. So he says, in this sense, it's more of Bitcoin is more typical of a precious metal. Instead of the supply changing to keep the value the same, the supply is predetermined and the value changes. As the number of users grows, the value per coin increases. It has the potential for a positive feedback loop, or a viral loop. As users increase, the value goes up, which could attract more users to take advantage of the increasing value. This is really critical because as more people believe in this new money, we don't have any data to show us how people started to believe in gold as money. That happened over hundreds of years in different locations, and there's no written record of that. So with Bitcoin becoming this new sound money, Satoshi was thinking through, how does Bitcoin become something real? How do I get people to believe in Bitcoin? How do I create this new wave of HODLer revolutionaries? And the price is a critical component of that. We all see this ourselves with your own trading patterns. I got to admit, when I first got into it in 2012, number go up was a pretty strong incentive. As the number went up, I became more convicted in my beliefs. I then told other people about it, which brought in more new HODLers. And this is how these loops work. And I've seen Bitcoin back when it was a tiny, tiny community back in San Francisco. When I got involved in the San Francisco Bitcoin meetup in early 2013, there was only a dozen of us. So to see Bitcoin go from that to where it is now, I very much have seen the effects of these the viral loop built into Bitcoin's network effect based on the price. That price also brings deeper liquidity, more services, easier onboarding, better educational materials. When I started writing articles about Bitcoin in 2018, but there was a ton of legacy content that I built on top of, folks that had written really great stuff that helped inspire me to write things. Each one of these waves brings around greater awareness, greater adoption, greater understanding of Bitcoin. Tomas Huber had a great quote that I really like, which is that HODLing bootstrapped Bitcoin into existence. HODLing increases value, which increases demand, hash rate, and network security, which in turn attracts new HODLers and devs. This self-reinforcing feedback loop drives Bitcoin's network effects, security, and value. It's very much this tight network effect. And this is a very simple graphic which demonstrates a traditional way that we would look at viral loops. Some of these have multiple more stages than just 3, but essentially you hear about Bitcoin, you then are convinced to go buy Bitcoin. After you buy Bitcoin and you become a hodler, you start to believe in Bitcoin. You then share that belief with friends. And then your friends go back to the C stage, or your friends begin the C stage. And that's where these viral loops kick in, is that these viral loops, the hodlers themselves represent the most fundamental components of Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't work without hodlers. If no one believes in Bitcoin, if no one stored value in Bitcoin, there's no security, in terms of the block reward, there's no security to ensure that the blockchain works. The blockchain only works because of the game theoretic setup that Satoshi has with the reward, the block reward. And so hodlers create that value in the block reward, which and therefore protects your transactions and therefore makes it all alive. Without that, Bitcoin is worthless, and there is no such thing as the immutability or 21 million guarantees in terms of the monetary policy. And this was the quote I mentioned earlier, which is around Satoshi referring to this viral loop effect that occurs. And when we look at Bitcoin, in contrast to the existing system, most of us were born into fiat money. When we pay for things, when our parents pay us for our allowance or give us money when we were younger, it was in our local fiat currency. Very rarely did parents give us gold or Bitcoin. And so hodling is the important part of taking a system from 0% mind share and belief to 100% or some very high percentage. It's the faith in this new financial system that binds everyone together. Bitcoin isn't just a software project. It's more of the software and the code enabling the social mechanics to occur. It's the code enforcing the rules of this social dynamic that we all agree upon. It's also a method of coordination of a large group of people, these hodlers, against a more powerful adversary. Bitcoin isn't just a technological revolution, it's more of a social one. And with money is a winner-take-all technology, and that's driven by network effects. The crypto with the most hodlers, or the most believers, therefore is the one most demanded by the world and will be the ultimate winner. And so, through that, what happens is, as Bitcoin's liquidity gets deeper, that means more and more market participants can buy Bitcoin. If you're a big hedge fund or you're a sovereign wealth fund, you can't buy $1 billion of Dogecoin. And sometimes their minimum allocation size is 10, 100 million, or $1 billion. That's the minimum they can invest. So Bitcoin's network effect in terms of believers is massive, and I would say is very unlikely to be ever overcome by another crypto asset. And Bitcoin ultimately promises this alternative for citizens across the world to keep their savings in a form that can't be confiscated nor diluted. And if Bitcoin grows much larger through this belief by the hodlers, if hodlers grow and grow and grow, Bitcoin will maybe force governments to become more voluntary, to where if everyone holds their money in Bitcoin, it's hard for governments to collect taxes because they can't just go seize their bank accounts. It makes governments much more voluntary. A lot of these rules and regulations, we didn't vote into existence. It was our parents or grandparents or great-great-grandparents who voted these in. Through hodling is ultimately the way that we become free. By hodling, and if we all choose to hodl, we all start to store our wealth in this alternative system. We then create a world that is incentivized and built through meritocracy, rather than individuals or governments or companies grabbing power and then using that to extract value from you. And one last part here that I think really sums this up very well is that those who opt into Bitcoin are trading something abundant for trading something scarce, trading the past for the future, trading something dependent for financial sovereignty. And that's why Bitcoiners and hodlers are truly the revolutionaries. By believing in Bitcoin, by buying into Bitcoin, they then enable this revolution. And that wraps up my my slide presentation. I know we've got about 15, 20 minutes here for Q&A. Let's see, on the Q&A slides, do I go back to my other view, or what would you guys like me to switch to? screen share. All right. Okay, cool. So I've got 15 minutes of Q&A here, and I'm looking at the chat room. All right. Yeah, thanks, Taran, on the quote around Bitcoin is as much social as technical. Yeah, appreciate you saying that. It's I totally agree. It's essentially enables, it's the code that in the architecture of that code that enables this social dynamic. And let's see, Brad. Yeah, Brad. I'll go ahead and share. I can pull up. Yeah, now that I'm not sharing my screen, I can add that quote. I can throw in those quotes for you. Here's the quote by Satoshi Nakamoto. All of these are visible. All of these are easily findable both on public forums or Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, where they've collected all of Satoshi's quotes together. Let's see. And then Aaron, can you go back the slide on the traits of money? Well, Aaron, I can give you the link to my article, which has that exact chart. And I also, if this is kind of a funny quirk when it comes to my articles that I write, is I score them with music. I heavily encourage that you play the music while you read it. I think it adds a little bit more of a fun social dynamic. So, Aaron, there you go. There's the article. Oh, let's see. Aaron says, "Oh, there's the Ask a Question tab." Oh, okay. All right, that definitely, okay, that helps. Let's see, can you put, all right, so Aaron sent you that. All right, so Carlos Chambers asked, which geos, parts of the world, do you guys, as Kraken, I work at Kraken, by the way, see the strongest DeepL or HODLer communities? That's a difficult question to answer because I think there's strong HODLers all across the world. I think that in terms of HODLers are particularly strong in the United States because a lot of the I would say it's an unfair advantage. Most of the content generated is in English. So English speakers, I think, have an unfair advantage in terms of understanding Bitcoin most easily. All the content out there is phenomenal. Podcasts, videos, tweets, long-form blog articles. So naturally, I think English-speaking countries in the United States has, I think, a pretty high market penetration of Bitcoin owners. I would say that's one of the stronger HODLer groups, but there are really strong HODLers everywhere. I don't think it's really too fair to say there's one group that is stronger than the other. I would just say the biggest one in terms of number of HODLers might be the United States. Let's see. Okay, this is a good question. So Sean Yeager, hopefully I pronounced that right, said, by what measure do you see Bitcoin passing to the medium of exchange era? This is a good question because a lot of people feel very strongly that Bitcoin should be used for day-to-day payments currently. I admire that will and the want for Bitcoin to most represent how we use fiat today, where you can store value in fiat, but you can also use it as like a day-to-day spending method. But for Bitcoin to transition to the medium of exchange era, it first has to be HODLed or used to store value by a very large percentage of the population. We use dollars at the corner store and at the grocery store because everyone else accepts dollars. It's a network effect. In order for us to switch away from that, greater than 50% of the population would both HODL Bitcoin, but then also want to spend it. And so I think we're another couple eras away from Bitcoin being that large in terms of market penetration for us to go to that medium of exchange era. Okay, I'm going to switch back over to the chat over here because I got a couple questions popping in. So Cole Albin asked, what is lacking from the Bitcoin ecosystem in terms of tools and software? I'm a really big proponent of software. It is important, but then we should also look at usability. Like, yes, code is important. The core developers are very important. And I know Steve Lee over at the Cash Square Crypto team, he's focused on helping fund UX research or like redesigning Bitcoin Core. I think that's phenomenal. Ultimately, human beings are animals that interact with software. And how they interact with it is typically via an interface, an app or a website that displays information in a way that helps me, the user, the human being, navigate a software tool. So I think there could be a lot done in terms of user experience. I've seen Bitcoin go from a pretty awful user experience when I got it in 2012. I mean, terrible, I was one of the only non-engineers to get in at that time, all the way till now, has made tremendous strides, but I don't think it's a job that's ever done. We must always push forward to make things easier to use, more simple to understand, and that's where, outside of my role at Kraken, which is focused on growth, my personal objective with my content, with my personal brand, is to make Bitcoin more understandable. If I can compress Bitcoin's narrative more simply and more people understand Bitcoin, then I think I've done something good for humankind. Nazar had kind of a fun, more personal question, which is what is one piece of advice you would give to a person who wants to be successful in this space? I think the number one piece of advice would be survive. Crypto is extremely hard to build a business in. You have these cycles of monsoons, so big bull runs, and droughts. So how do you plan around headcounts? How do you plan around budgeting? How do you plan your product development? So ultimately, in these droughts is the best time to go build, because then you'll be ready for the monsoon. But if you build too fast in the drought and you run out of money, you won't be ready for the monsoon. Business planning is super tough in this space. I would say be critical about that, but critical about survival, and then also about the transitory sort of narratives that occur. Bitcoin is a core narrative that has been there from day one. It is the largest market, largest number of hodlers, largest volume, etc. That will always be there. These other narratives that come in and out, whether it be ICOs or something else. I mean, when was the last time you heard ICO? It's been a while, right? So these narratives ebb and flow, and if you build your business model around the term ICO or the narratives around that, you might be struggling right now to have your business find product market fit. Randall has I would say this is a Dave Portnoy question, which is if we start mining gold on asteroids, what will that do to Bitcoin's price metrics? So the Winklevi sat down with Dave Portnoy, a very big personality who talks about his day trading escapades. The Winklevi started to talk to him about Bitcoin, and he had some questions around the supply. And that was pretty funny, because they start talking about how there's trillions and trillions of dollars worth of gold just in the asteroids, really close to our Earth. So when we look at the supply of gold, it's unverifiable. We know that there's a lot of it just not close to us. When we look at gold's duration or survival as a species of money, it's not going to last. It will not last when humans go out into space and we start to colonize different planets. So at a maximum, gold's lifespan might only be another 100 years. So that alone is the writing on the wall in terms of gold's place as sound money. Let's see. So Brad asked a question around. You talked mostly about Bitcoin being used for the HODLer use case or store value use case, but what are alternative? What are alternative tokens for other? What about hodling alt tokens for other use cases besides money? Well, when we look at money represents a critical function in an economy, which is it reduces barter. It solves the coincidence of wants problem. Coincidence of wants problem is where I have an apple and you have a horse, and we have to coincidentally both want to sell either or asset at that time. Money solves that problem by being that core medium of exchange, unit of account, and store value, being the transition between two different assets. That's important because that's important to think about it from that perspective, because if we look at, if we had 10,000 or 100,000 tokens out there, that's called barter. That means that we would simply be bartering for one asset for another, and that we haven't solved the coincidence of wants problem. Also, there's a liquidity network effect too, to where market participants want to get in and out of that core money, and there's no reason why there should be thousands of that money. There should only be one money. And then as one money is more demanded by market participants, let's say I only want to hold Bitcoin or only want to be paid in Bitcoin, or I only want to pay for things in Bitcoin, that reinforces that network effect to where I don't think we'll see tons of other assets. When it comes to other use cases of blockchain tech inherently is very, very poor at doing almost everything. Satoshi custom built blockchain tech to build Bitcoin. And it's sort of like if someone built a tank for warfare, you don't then use that tank to go plant a garden or use it for ride sharing. It's been specifically built for that one function. And so I think blockchains can be useful at other things. I think a lot of it has been tied to a highly speculative sort of reasoning about what these might be useful for. Inevitably, it'll have to be something that stores very high, economically dense information on chain. Let's see. So we've got Andy Geo. So I've only got a couple more minutes here, so I want to be cognizant of my time. Andy Geo asked, how do you see Bitcoin continuing to maintaining its security when mining rewards dramatically decrease as the available mining supply reduces? So what Andy's talking about, the block reward is comprised of newly minted Bitcoins, and that's called the block subsidy, and the transaction fees. So over time, as Bitcoin continues upon its supply issuance schedule, every 4 years it goes through a halving. And in the halving, it reduces the block subsidy, the newly minted coins, in that block reward by half. And so the worry is that this block reward incentivizes miners to behave properly. If that falls to a certain level, that will lead to a bad game theoretic environment. But what we've seen empirically is that as Bitcoin's subsidy, or the newly minted coins, there's less and less put into each block, the value of that block reward has increased exponentially. So as Bitcoin's supply is minted, the newly minted coins in each block drop every 4 years due to halving. Even though they drop, the value per coin increases dramatically through these boom bust cycles, and transaction fees have increasingly started to replace the subsidy. So the metric you'd want to look at here would be the subsidy over transaction fees inside the block reward. So are transaction fees replacing the subsidy over time? And if we look at that, it very much is. Even as the subsidy's value in terms of dollars, which is a more stable unit of account that we can measure purchasing power through over time more effectively, the subsidy is replacing transaction fees are replacing the subsidy over time. So I don't think we have much to worry about. I wrote an article about this called Bitcoin Security is Fine, where I comprehensively go through this topic. I could spend an hour talking about this, so unfortunately I'll have to move on to the next question. Let's see. Okay, I'll switch back over to the questions. So I was looking at the main chat. Okay, how do you believe Bitcoin will coexist as countries create their own digital currencies? This is a great question. I actually get this one quite a bit when I do Q&As, which are people asking about central bank currencies. How do central bank currencies compete with Bitcoin? And I don't really think they do. Bitcoin's revolution wasn't digital payments. I mean, digital payments existed before Bitcoin. Bitcoin solves trust. As Satoshi has said before, trust is the problem that he's solving. Trust makes all of these existing legacy systems work. But then in 2008, we find out that all of these things fail because we had to trust someone. Bitcoin removes trust from the equation. And that's where, when we look at Bitcoin competing with other money, even if a government puts their money in a more fluid form to transact, let's say make it easier to send through some digitalization of that fiat currency, it doesn't solve the trust problem. It doesn't solve our trust in the monetary policy. It doesn't solve our trust that they won't manipulate it or move it up and down or change it or redenominate it. And that's what Bitcoin solves. We believe in the 21 million hard cap. That 21 million hard cap is enforced by the collective belief in the system. And that is what the innovation, that's the innovation that Bitcoin brings. It's not that it's digital, it's that it's immutable and the monetary policy can't be changed. And looks like we're right out of our time.
Cool. Thanks so much for this really great talk. We're going to transition now to our next session.
Okay, great.
Thank you.